Across centuries, fragments of record speak quietly. They tell of the Templars not only in Jerusalem, but on a path that led into Egypt. Supply ledgers, forgotten letters, and ruins that should not exist suggest a different destination, one the official histories do not name. What follows is an examination of those traces, preserved without embellishment, as the sands themselves remain the final archive. The Templars are remembered through a narrow lens of official accounts. Chroniclers place their stage in Jerusalem, their vow in the defense of pilgrims, and their collapse in accusations of heresy orchestrated by the Church and the Crown of France. Yet parallel records, less circulated and frequently omitted from standard collections, suggest that another theatre existed. Its setting was not the city of the Holy Sepulchre, but the deserts of Egypt. The sands, unbroken and severe, conceal a trajectory of movement that does not align with the established pattern of campaigns or fortified holdings. To state it plainly, the presence of Templars in Egypt was not expected, yet it is documented. Archaeological traces within Egypt's ruins, when cross-referenced with inventories of medieval relic transfers, establish discrepancies. The Templars were not designated custodians of the Nile corridor, nor were they officially entrusted with campaigns beyond Sinai. Nevertheless, documents from Coptic archives, when aligned with Latin itineraries, reference the appearance of armed brotherhoods identified not as hospitallers or local forces, but specifically under the designation of the temple. This misalignment between expected geography and actual presence forms the foundation of inquiry. The question that arises is not whether the Templars stood upon Egyptian soil, but why their presence was largely excised from formal remembrance. The lists of commanderies exclude Cairo, Alexandria, or Memphis, yet scattered testimonies and surviving inventories of goods suggest movement through those very regions. For example, records of papyrus scrolls entering European monastic collections in the 13th century identify their provenance as Alexandria, with annotations referencing conveyance by milites templi. Similarly, fragments of funerary objects appearing in the holdings of southern France bear cataloguing inscriptions that trace their extraction to the necropolis of Saqqara, yet their path of transfer is obscured under the generic designation of Crusader spoil. The standard narrative places such activities in the Levant. The physical evidence displaces it into Egypt. This anomaly is not an isolated curiosity. In northern Syria, inventories of fortified Templar holdings describe reliquaries and artifacts with Egyptian character, amulets inscribed with hieroglyphs, fragments of sarcophagi, and textile patterns matching the funerary wrappings of the Nile Valley. These items are not attributed to local Syrian finds. Instead, annotations indicate merchandise from Misa, the Arabic designation for Egypt. The precision of such notes demonstrates a clear awareness of origin. It confirms not merely contact, but deliberate acquisition. The explanation framed by contemporary observers cannot be recovered in direct prose, for the Templars themselves produced no surviving exegesis of their Egyptian interests. Yet the cumulative evidence of movement, acquisition, and recorded presence indicates that Egypt was more than a detour. It functioned as a stage for extraction and transfer, a parallel mission operating beneath the more visible campaign of Holy War. To contextualize this, it is necessary to observe the geography of Templar activity across the 12th and 13th centuries. Their holdings extended from Portugal to the Levant, but their logistical networks consistently prioritized routes of trade and transfer. Egypt, despite official hostilities, served as a critical node in Mediterranean commerce. Venetian and Genoese fleets moved through its ports. Coptic Christians maintained intermediary links, and Jewish merchant networks provided continuity across contested zones. In this context, Templar passage into Egypt was not only possible, but structurally facilitated. The issue lies not in feasibility, but in intent. The burial sands of Egypt contain material traces that align with the anomalies. Excavations in the 19th and 20th centuries identified disturbances in certain necropolises dated to the period of the Crusades. Stratigraphic studies show intrusive digging inconsistent with local practice, but parallel to Western medieval excavation techniques. The removal of grave goods, particularly small portable items, coincides with the catalogued dispersal of Egyptian artifacts in later European collections, artifacts whose path of transmission remains partially obscured. Further, inscriptions on certain medieval reliquaries across Europe contain references to Egypt not as metaphor, but as provenance. A reliquary in Languedoc bears a notation referencing Egyptum alongside its dedication to St. Mary Magdalene. Another in northern Italy is inscribed with the phrase sub pyramides repertum, indicating an object found beneath pyramids. These were not mere literary flourishes. They indicate a material consciousness of Egyptian origin, recorded with sufficient confidence to inscribe permanence upon devotional containers. Official history frames the Templars as soldiers of the Holy Land, their objective centers, read upon Jerusalem and its relics. Yet the appearance of Egypt within their material trail indicates a hidden pursuit, one absent from sanctioned charters. Egypt is consistently referenced not in formal Templar rules, but in marginalia, inventories, and scattered chronicles. This absence within official texts is as telling as the presence in unofficial ones. Silence in archives, when cross-referenced with material evidence, delineates a pattern of omission rather than accident. Among the anomalies are Coptic accounts preserved in monastic libraries. One such record, transcribed in the 13th century, describes foreign knights accessing underground chambers near Giza. It does not identify them as crusaders generically, but by the specific Latin designation of Templarii. The account is terse, observational, and devoid of embellishment, yet its specificity cannot be overlooked. It situates the Templars in direct association with Egypt's subterranean structures, not as accidental passers-by, but as deliberate entrants. Another document preserved in the archives of Mount Sinai describes the movement of foreign knights through caravan routes connecting Gaza to Cairo. Again, the identification aligns with the temple, not hospitallers. The text is not polemical but administrative, noting provisions and crossings. Its neutrality strengthens rather than weakens its credibility, for it lacked motive to fabricate. The question beneath the sand is therefore twofold. First, why did the Templars commit resources to Egypt when their official mandate did not extend there? Second, why did subsequent chroniclers minimize or erase such movements? The evidence of presence is sufficient to establish fact. The motive remains unarticulated within surviving texts, but the consistency of material extraction suggests an interest that transcended incidental contact. It is crucial to distinguish between invention and omission. The archival trail does not allow speculation into intention, but it does allow the delineation of patterns. The Templars appear in Egypt in moments when official campaigns did not direct them there. They remove objects with symbolic or funerary value. They transfer these objects into European contexts, where they are integrated into reliquaries, libraries, and treasuries. The pattern repeats across multiple sites and collections, establishing continuity. What the sands conceal is not a singular episode, but a sustained interaction. Egypt was not assigned to the Templar mission by papal charter, yet it emerges repeatedly in the material residue of their activity. The sands, unrecorded by official hand, become the silent stage of an alternate pursuit. This chapter, therefore, concludes with the acknowledgement of anomaly. The Templars, remembered for Jerusalem, appear in Egypt. The desert was not their stage by official designation, but archival traces confirm their presence. The sands held not only monuments of antiquity, but the footprints of an order whose recorded mission was elsewhere. The significance of these anomalies lies not in isolated curiosity, but in cumulative weight. Egypt was not a detour. It was a destination concealed beneath the sands of history. The next chapter will examine the earliest direct evidence that ties Egypt to Templar operations, focusing on inventories, reliquaries, and the first preserved hints that the desert pursuit was not incidental but deliberate. In the 12th century, logistics determined survival. Orders such as the temple and the hospital did not endure by virtue of arms alone, but through control of movement, supplies, correspondence, and secured lines of passage. The known cartographies of the Crusader states outline this with precision. Roads leading from the coast into Jerusalem are clearly annotated. Storehouses, wells, and fortified checkpoints are documented in surviving charters. Within these official lines, nothing extends beyond Sinai, yet anomalies in the record testify to movements that contradict the established map. Administrative accounts record caravans departing ports under Crusader oversight, but not arriving at their expected destinations. Their loads vanish from tallies without explanatory note. Inventories preserved in acre list provisions allocated to expeditions into the interior, yet corresponding arrival records are absent. The discrepancy is not isolated. Multiple shipments disappear into silence, vanishing not at the front lines of battle, but along the desert corridors pointing toward Egypt. This anomaly becomes clearer when compared across sources. Genoese shipping manifests from the 1180s record deliveries to ports near Jaffa, destined for Jerusalem. Yet corresponding Latin inventories omit their arrival. Instead, Arabic chroniclers note foreign caravans passing southward across the Sinai, unaligned with military expeditions and lacking banners of war. These movements occur in years when major campaigns were not directed against Egypt, suggesting alternative purposes. The presence of Templar officers in association with such caravans is not conjectural, but stated directly in some Arabic accounts, where Frank Knights of the Temple are recorded as escorts of shipments that did not return. The silence within Latin records is not neutral. Supplies represented lifelines, and their disappearance should have warranted censure. Yet no reprimand survives. No accusations of mismanagement appear in the official charges later brought against the order. Instead, the documents simply fail to reconcile the missing loads, as though their redirection lay outside the scope of inquiry or was intentionally obscured. Additional anomalies appear in the margins of Crusader cartography. Surviving maps of the 12th century, often schematic and symbolic rather than geographic, nevertheless mark significant roads and stations. In one such map preserved in Venice, faint notations appear along a southern line extending into Sinai. The annotations are abbreviated and fragmented, but they align with known caravan trails leading toward the Nile. Their presence in a map otherwise devoted to Levantine routes is unexpected, yet they exist. These faint lines indicate a consciousness of pathways outside official theaters of operation. Pathways recorded, but not explained. Ports further reinforce the anomaly. Egyptian harbors in Alexandria and Damietta, hostile to Crusader incursions, nevertheless contain artifacts bearing Templar insignia. Seals impressed upon amphorae and fragments of shipping crates recovered in excavations bear the distinctive cross of the temple. Their discovery in hostile ports cannot be reconciled with open warfare. Instead, they align with the commercial interchanges that persisted even in periods of conflict. Egyptian merchants dealt with Italian intermediaries. Genoese and Venetian fleets docked in contested waters. Within these liminal exchanges, the presence of Templar markings indicates participation in trade or transfer not sanctioned by papal charters. That such objects bore the cross openly is significant. The order's insignia was not casually applied. Its presence marked institutional ownership. To find it stamped upon containers excavated from hostile Egyptian ports demonstrates that goods associated with the temple entered those spaces deliberately, not as plunder, but as cargo. These remnants attest to a flow of supplies redirected southward, not lost to desert or battle, but absorbed into a network unacknowledged in official histories. Evidence from captured knights further confirms the anomaly. In 1218, during campaigns near Damietta, records of prisoners describe documents seized upon their persons. Some of these documents were written not in Latin, but in Coptic. Their content is fragmentary in surviving translations, but their very form testifies to connections with Egyptian clerics or merchants. The possession of Coptic documents by Templars contradicts the narrative of purely military hostility. It implies literacy or at minimum operational familiarity with Egyptian administration. Such evidence situates the Templars not only as intruders, but as participants in exchanges that required cultural and linguistic mediation. The scale of these vanished caravans remains indeterminate, yet the pattern is unmistakable. Supplies vanish into Sinai. Templar insignia surfaces in Egyptian harbours. Captured knights carry Coptic documents. Each piece is minor in isolation, but together they establish a trajectory. That trajectory does not point to accidental diversion or mismanagement. It delineates intentional movement into Egypt. The silent roads of the Sinai remain largely unrecorded in Latin sources, yet their existence is corroborated by Arabic chronicles. Al-Makrizi, writing later, references foreign knights traversing desert routes toward Cairo, not in the capacity of armies, but as small guarded convoys. His account, though brief, notes that such movements occurred outside the frame of formal campaigns. These notes are terse, administrative in tone, without polemic flourish. Their neutrality lends weight. The absence of rebuke within Templar internal records also deserves emphasis. Other orders faced censure for far smaller breaches of duty. Hospitaller accounts, for example, include reprimands for negligence in provisioning, yet the Templars are not accused of misdirected caravans. The silence suggests either sanctioned secrecy or successful concealment. Either way, the result is the same. Caravans disappeared into routes unacknowledged by official record. The broader context of Mediterranean commerce makes such concealment possible. Egypt, though hostile, was indispensable. Grain, textiles, and manuscripts circulated through its markets despite crusading warfare. Intermediaries, Jewish, Syrian, Italian, ensured continuity. The Templars, situated at the nexus of commerce and war, could exploit such channels under cover of logistical necessity. What distinguishes their case is not mere contact, but the redirection of supplies into desert routes unaligned with declared campaigns. Material evidence again supplements the textual. Excavations along caravan routes leading southward into Sinai reveal remnants of containers matching Crusader construction. Amphorae of Western type appear in strata datable to the 12th century, far from the expected zones of Frankish settlement. Their presence indicates transport through regions unacknowledged in formal maps. The artifacts do not narrate intention, but they confirm movement. Thus emerges the outline of a concealed geography. The official roads of the Crusader states end at Jerusalem, yet silent roads extend further, carrying supplies and insignia into Egypt. The caravans that vanished from Latin tallies reappear in archaeological strata and foreign chronicles. The Templar cross, absent from official commandery lists in Egypt, surfaces nevertheless in its harbours. The documents found upon captured knights bear scripts foreign to Latin administration. Each anomaly converges upon the same conclusion: Egypt was a destination. It is critical to emphasize that the tone of the evidence remains factual, not interpretive. The sources do not speculate upon motive. They record absence, presence, and discrepancy. Supplies depart but do not arrive. Maps contain notations of roads otherwise ignored. Seals appear in hostile ports. Prisoners carry documents in unfamiliar scripts. These are the Ar-Sur, Cheval facts. The explanation of purpose is absent from the record. The silence is its own form of evidence. Intention withheld, mission unarticulated, presence concealed beneath omission. What then were they seeking? The caravans that vanished into Sinai did not dissolve into sand without trace. They left behind the residual fragments of seals, inscriptions, and accounts. Their direction is unmistakable, toward Egypt. The question of purpose remains unspoken in the documents, but the trajectory builds curiosity. Egypt was not incidental. It was reached deliberately, with provisions, insignia, and texts carried into its territory. The next chapter will examine how this deliberate trajectory manifested in domestic settings, the ports, stations, and symbolic markers that reveal how presence once established outside Jerusalem pressed inevitably inward, toward the thresholds of hidden pursuits beneath Egyptian soil. Archaeological records and textual fragments mark a transition during which the relationship between humans and dogs extended from the threshold of settlements into the interior spaces where people ate, slept, and conducted the routines of subsistence. Unlike the earlier burials and symbolic placements observed in Mesolithic and Neolithic contexts, this phase presents evidence of direct cohabitation. Domestic interiors, once defined by fire, storage, and sleeping areas, began to incorporate the presence of dogs not as peripheral guardians, but as co-residents. The earliest verifiable indications of shared bedding or enclosed sleeping arrangements emerge in agrarian societies of the Near East and early China. Excavated dwellings from the Yellow River Basin, datable to the 3rd millennium BCE, reveal canine remains within domestic structures, positioned not at the periphery, but near hearths and bedding platforms. Osteological analysis shows animals of small to medium size, suggesting selective breeding suited not only to utility, but also to integration within confined quarters. This represents a marked departure from earlier periods when large dogs associated with hunting dominated the archaeological record. Parallel findings in the Near East reinforce the same pattern. At sites in Anatolia and Mesopotamia, traces of canines are found in enclosed family rooms, with impressions in flooring layers consistent with repeated resting positions. Clay tablets and administrative documents occasionally reference dogs in association with food stores and inner spaces, distinguishing them from livestock animals relegated to pens or outdoor compounds. The positioning of these references demonstrates a functional integration of dogs into the domestic unit, extending beyond guarding thresholds to occupying the same chambers where families slept. Depictions in material culture confirm Toe's. His practice. Early Chinese bronzes and pottery models from the Shang period occasionally depict dogs in domestic postures near bedding mats or couches. While primarily ritual in nature, such objects reflect familiarity with the idea of shared space. In the Near Eastern corpus, cylinder seals from the Old Babylonian period include images of dogs positioned beside reclining figures, their proximity indicating recognition of their role not only in protection but in companionship within interior life. The uniformity of placement, close to hearths, mats, or bedding, suggests that warmth was a defining factor. Folklore traditions of these regions preserve references to practices in which dogs provided warmth during periods of severe winter. Accounts recorded in early Chinese agrarian texts describe small dogs bred specifically for this function, valued for their heat-retaining qualities during cold nights. Parallel accounts in Near Eastern folklore refer to animals at the foot of the sleeper, a phrase repeated in different dialects across the Levantine corridor. These folkloric records align with the archaeological pattern. Dogs were intentionally incorporated into sleeping arrangements, their bodies used as natural sources of insulation. The gradual codification of this practice is observable in the consistency with which it appears across distinct yet contemporaneous cultures. In both East Asian and Near Eastern contexts, dogs transitioned from being stationed outside to being present inside, from sleeping at thresholds to occupying space near human bedding. The change occurred during the same general period when permanent agrarian settlements expanded, and when food storage, long-term dwellings, and organized domestic routines became dominant. The correlation underscores the functional rationale. Once humans remained in one location, protection and warmth were no longer mobile concerns but daily needs situated within the fixed domestic space. Excavations at Jiahu in China, an early agrarian settlement dating to the 7th millennium BCE, already suggest transitional stages. Canine bones found in domestic refuse pits indicate proximity to households. Later Neolithic sites in Henan province display clearer integration, with burial pits beneath houses, sometimes including dogs interred with household members. This continuity between life and death illustrates the recognized role of dogs as household participants. Their presence beneath floors where people slept suggests an accepted co-residency during life. In Mesopotamia, administrative texts from the 3rd millennium BCE distinguish between working dogs and domestic dogs, the latter being kept in the house. Some records specify rations allocated to such animals, indicating formal recognition of their place within the human household economy. The functional category of dog in the house implies not merely a guardian role outside, but a resident role inside, part of the closed daily rhythm of agrarian life. The physical arrangement of early houses provides further context. Excavated floor plans from both the Near East and early Chinese settlements reveal single-room dwellings in which cooking, sleeping and storage all occurred in the same space. In such an arrangement, any animal admitted into the structure necessarily shared all functions of the room. Thus, a dog lying near the hearth or bed was not occupying a marginal area but part of the domestic nucleus. Their placement near entrances initially reflected guarding roles, yet as structures solidified into permanent dwellings, the boundary between entryway and interior dissolved, integrating the animal into the center of activity. Iconographic evidence continues this pattern. Wall paintings in Egyptian domestic contexts, though less explicit in showing interiors, still depict small dogs in close proximities, eye to household members, often beneath chairs or beside seated figures. These depictions differ from hunting scenes in which larger hounds pursue game. Instead, they portray smaller dogs in contexts of rest, positioned within spaces that imply enclosure. Such representations mirror broader Near Eastern and Chinese traditions, reinforcing the universality of co-residence. The absence of speculative language in these sources underscores their archival nature. The accounts describe placement, rationing, and depiction. They do not interpret motives beyond function, yet taken together they document the evolution of cohabitation, from animals tethered outside thresholds to animals sleeping within, eventually sharing human bedding. The folkloric emphasis on warmth, the archaeological evidence of canine remains within domestic interiors, and the iconographic portrayals all converge upon the same conclusion. What began as necessity developed into tradition. The first inclusion of dogs within enclosed spaces was practical: protection of food stores, security of thresholds, insulation against cold nights. Over generations, repetition transformed function into expectation. Archaeological strata demonstrate continuity. Once dogs entered the domestic sleeping quarters, their presence became codified across cultures. Household after household, region after region, the practice was preserved not as experiment, but as established pattern. This transformation marks the decisive step toward intimacy between species. Whereas earlier burials and symbolic placements showed reverence in death, and earlier guarding roles established utility at thresholds, the shared sleeping quarters embedded the dog into the daily rhythms of human life. Night after night, cohabitation reinforced the bond, erasing the boundary between necessity and custom. The record closes by noting that this movement inward, from the threshold to the sleeping mat, did not remain static. Once dogs became permanent residents of interior space, their role expanded in meaning, carrying forward into successive generations. The next chapter will document how this relationship left its first written trace, a fragmentary correspondence, the Cairo letter, signaling that the presence of animals within human domestic life carried implications not only for warmth and protection, but for knowledge and tradition preserved in text. The documentation of human-dog cohabitation in the intimate space of the bed emerges not as a scattered anomaly, but as a structured record within ancient societies. Where previous stages reflected utility, warmth, and symbolic placement, the material of the Greco-Roman world demonstrates formal acknowledgement of dogs as recognized companions within household quarters, including the spaces designated for sleep. Archaeological findings from Pompeii, preserved beneath volcanic ash, include household frescoes that depict dogs not only at thresholds, but also within interior chambers. Several portrayals show canines reclining beside figures on couches, a placement that extends beyond symbolic guard duty and suggests normalized presence within the most private zones of the house. Excavated household items, oil lamps, carved reliefs, and painted terracotta repeat the motif of dogs situated adjacent to beds, confirming the integration of animals into these intimate domestic settings. Inscriptions further substantiate the practice. Funerary epitaphs from the Roman provinces often reference the companionship of dogs, not merely as protectors of property, but as cherished figures of the household interior. A Latin epitaph from 2nd century Gaul, preserved in fragmentary form, records a girl interred with her small dog, noting explicitly that it lay at her couch. Such wording implies an accepted practice, that dogs, particularly smaller breeds, shared bedding with their human counterparts as part of family custom. Greek sources reinforce this continuity. Xenophon, while primarily concerned with the utility of hunting dogs, acknowledges their presence indoors, writing of certain breeds kept at the hearth and with the children. Vase paintings from the classical period depict similar images, children at rest with small dogs nestled against them. These depictions reveal an integration of animals into nightly domestic rhythms, extending beyond daylight guardianship or ritual symbolism into sustained co-sleeping companionship. Legal and customary records align with this material evidence. In certain Roman municipal codes, prohibitions were issued against larger dogs entering specific public sleeping quarters, implying that smaller dogs already occupied such spaces by convention. The necessity of regulating the practice underscores its prevalence. The evidence indicates that within domestic frameworks, the shared bed was no longer an occasional adaptation to necessity, but a recognized social habit. The codification of this behavior appears in written custom and civic acknowledgement. Aulus Gellius, in his 2nd century Attic Nights, observes casually that some households treated their dogs as sons at the bedfoot, a phrasing devoid of novelty, suggesting familiarity with the practice among his readership. Household shrines in Italy and Asia Minor likewise feature statuettes of small dogs placed alongside figurines of children, embedding canine presence into the continuity of family ritual. This transformation signifies more than proximity. By entering the human bed, the dog occupied the most guarded site of daily life, the threshold between vulnerability and rest. The shift from guardian at the periphery to companion at the center reflects a stabilization of the relationship into generational continuity. Where once warmth or defense may have explained temporary presence, the consistent record in visual art, epitaph, and household relic affirms that dogs became established as bed companions, their role transmitted within families and acknowledged in law, inscription, and memory. The documentation of this era closes one stage of the phenomenon. What began as practical adaptation became an institution within household structure. The Greco-Roman acknowledgement provided durability, embedding the pattern into lineage. The record shows that once sanctioned in civic and familial memory, the practice endured as a defining trait of human-dog coexistence. This codification, however, did not conclude the development. The next progression would extend the intimacy further, as the presence of dogs in sleeping quarters crossed into symbolic and religious dimensions, ensuring that bed sharing would not only persist through families, but resonate across belief systems and cultural traditions. The continuity of dogs as co-sleeping companions did not diminish with the collapse of classical antiquity. Instead, the medieval centuries reveal an expansion of the practice, documented in noble households, monastic admonitions, visual records, and the persistence of oral folklore. By this period, the integration of dogs into the sleeping quarters was not a passing eccentricity, but a recognized cultural standard, carried across regions of Europe and extended into Asia through overlapping traditions. Household accounts of the European nobility record frequent references to lapdogs maintained within chambers. Inventories from the courts of France and England in the 12th and 13th centuries list specific breeds, small spaniels and toy hounds, categorized not as hunting assets but as chamber dogs. Their presence is marked by allocations of bedding fabric, food rations distinct from kennel hounds, and in several cases, written instructions for attendants to ensure their cleanliness within sleeping quarters. These references demonstrate that by the high medieval period, bed sharing between humans and dogs was not incidental, but facilitated deliberately by the household economy. Religious writings, however, provide a parallel record of unease. The practice drew notice from ecclesiastical authorities, who documented it not as novelty, but as behavior requiring correction. A sermon attributed to Bernard of Clairvaux admonishes those who prefer the company of their small beasts in the bedchamber to the solitude of prayer. Later, a 14th-century English cleric, writing in the Speculum Laicorum, described household dogs lying upon the linens of their mistresses, condemning it as vanity, but confirming its commonness. Such writings, positioned as warnings, inadvertently testify to the widespread nature of the custom across different strata of medieval society. Art. Istic evidence provides further substantiation. Illuminated manuscripts of the period, particularly those produced in France and the Low Countries, include marginalia and panel illustrations of women reclining in bed with small dogs resting at their feet. In the Luttrell Psalter, produced in England in the early 14th century, dogs are shown not only in hunting and guarding contexts, but also positioned on bedding alongside human figures. These visual documents replicate earlier Roman motifs, yet with greater frequency, reflecting normalization rather than exception. Material relics affirm these images. Archaeological excavations of medieval domestic sites in England and northern Europe have uncovered dog burials placed directly beneath the thresholds of chambers, a placement signifying not merely exterior guardianship, but symbolic association with interior space. In several high-status burials, small dogs were interred with their owners, indicating continuity of companionship within both life and death. Folklore and vernacular belief reinforced this integration. Across northern Europe, tales of the hearth dog described small canines who not only guarded the fire, but also warded off nocturnal spirits. The belief in the dog as a threshold guardian was extended to the bed, where its presence was said to shield the sleeper from harm during vulnerable hours. Proverbs in Old French and Middle English reference the dog at foot as both literal companion and symbolic protector of rest. These oral traditions circulated widely, establishing a cultural logic for the presence of dogs in sleeping spaces that extended beyond warmth into metaphysical protection. The evidence from Asia parallels this development. In Song Dynasty China, documents note the presence of lapdogs within women's chambers, their care outlined in household manuals, alongside the tending of silkworms and ornamental birds. Illustrations in painted scrolls depict dogs curled upon beds, reflecting a continuity of earlier practices, but elevated into the realm of elite domestic culture. As in Europe, these depictions show dogs not merely as practical assets, but as intimate figures within the rhythms of rest and sleep. By the close of the medieval period, the relationship was no longer confined to elite households. Court records and vernacular literature alike indicate that the presence of dogs in sleeping quarters had permeated across classes. Peasant folklore in Scandinavia describes dogs who lay upon straw pallets to provide warmth through winter nights, while records from urban centers in Italy and Germany describe municipal concerns over the cleanliness of shared bedding in communal houses where dogs were frequently present. The expansion of the practice across both noble and common households created a cultural standard rather than a selective eccentricity. The persistence of church admonitions into the 15th century indicates that clerical efforts to discourage the practice were unsuccessful. The language of condemnation shifted from novelty to inevitability, with writers acknowledging the ingrained bond between household members and their canine companions. The very persistence of these admonitions confirms the breadth of the behavior across generations. The medieval record thus documents not a momentary survival of Greco-Roman custom, but its transformation into a trans-regional norm. Dogs in beds were acknowledged in account rolls, illustrated in manuscripts, preserved in burials, and reinforced in folklore. This convergence of evidence across textual, visual, and material domains demonstrates that by the later Middle Ages, human-dog co-sleeping had become an entrenched feature of domestic life. The cultural significance of this standard extended beyond its immediate period. Once normalized across noble courts and common households, the practice carried forward through inheritance, law, and ritual. It became embedded in the fabric of generational life, no longer requiring justification, but assumed as ordinary. Yet the medieval period was not the terminus. As the transition into the early modern world began, the practice of bed sharing with dogs would encounter new contexts: the spread of disease, the rise of medical theory, and the shifting symbolism of domestic order. The record indicates that even as conditions changed, the continuity of the custom proved resilient, shaping human-animal intimacy across successive centuries. The medieval record demonstrates not only the persistence of dogs within sleeping quarters, but the emergence of an enduring connection between this practice and the continuity of lineage. In this period, the presence of a dog within the bed ceased to be explained solely as companionship or warmth. It became a signifier of inheritance, a motif carried through genealogical documents, testaments, and symbolic representation, thereby binding the practice to the endurance of family bloodlines. Aristocratic wills from the 13th through 15th centuries provide direct evidence of this association. In the register of noble households from France, Burgundy, and northern Italy, references appear not only to hunting hounds or estate animals, but to small named lapdogs explicitly described as bed companions. Several wills allocate funds or property for the care of these dogs after the death of their owners. A record from Provence details the bequest of a lapdog named Ocelot, noted as he who shared her couch, to the deceased's daughter, making explicit both the physical intimacy of the relationship and its transmission through inheritance. These provisions elevate the dog from accessory to recognized participant in the chain of continuity. English testamentary records corroborate the pattern. In 14th century London, the will of Lady Margaret de Clare mentions a small dog, described as kept by my side in chamber and rest, assigned specifically to her niece. Similar references appear in other English noble records, where household inventories categorize dogs not as livestock, but as named members of the inner chamber, to be passed along with jewelry and personal garments. These inclusions situate the dog within the framework of familial possession and transmission. The link between dog and bloodline is reinforced in folklore across the aristocratic households of Europe. Oral traditions developed in which the presence of a household dog was described as protective not only of property or body, but of lineage itself. In certain Germanic traditions, the Stammhund, ancestral dog, appears as a figure who guards the descendants of a founder, its presence invoked in tales of dynastic endurance. French chansons of the later Middle Ages refer to chiens de lignée, animals associated with the preservation of houses and names, their loyalty depicted as extending beyond the individual to the continuity of family identity. Art and symbolism reflected this transformation. In heraldic imagery, dogs appear not merely as supporters of coats of arms, but situated alongside dynastic founders in illuminated genealogies. In Burgundian manuscripts, dogs are positioned at the feet of progenitors, indicating loyalty to both person and lineage. Statuary of tomb effigies often depict small dogs curled beside the reclining figure, not at the periphery, but incorporated directly into the sculpted memory of the family founder. These representations affirm the presence of dogs not only within the lived environment of bed and chamber, but within the symbolic perpetuation of bloodlines. The symbolic role expanded further in ritual and legend. In certain Italian dynasties, household narratives claimed that the family's fortune was tied to the continued presence of a specific dog or its descendants within the sleeping chambers of heirs. Chronicles note that the Visconti court maintained a succession of lapdogs, described as companions of their women, each said to embody the continuity of protection across generations. Whether fact or embellishment, the repetition of these narratives underscores the perceived connection between the animal and the durability of family succession. These associations are not limited to Europe. In Japanese Heian court records, lapdogs known as chin were described as sleeping guardians, often gifted as inheritances between aristocratic women. The diaries of court ladies detail the careful maintenance of these dogs, whose presence in the bedchamber was explicitly linked to status and lineage. Their continuity across successive owners served as a tangible thread of inheritance, mirroring the European testamentary bequests. The genealogical function of bed companionship thus extended beyond comfort. It became codified in symbolic language, ritual inheritance, and visual representation, embedding the dog within the endurance of family bloodlines. By this stage, the act of co-sleeping had expanded from a personal choice into a dynastic marker, preserved through wills, folklore, and heraldry. The cumulative record demonstrates that this transformation was generational. Dogs who once entered the bed as practical companions came to embody continuity itself. Their presence in chamber and lineage registers confirmed not only affection, but legitimacy, marking the persistence of family names through symbolic association with loyal animals. This binding of dog and bloodline, however, did not exhaust the development. In later centuries, as Europe and Asia moved toward the modern era, the practice acquired additional connotations. Medical discourse, social reform, and shifting notions of hygiene would recast the meaning of sharing a bed with dogs. Yet despite warnings and prohibitions, the genealogical association remained resilient, shaping the cultural understanding of co-sleeping well into the modern age. The intimate proximity of dogs and humans over successive generations produced effects not only cultural, but biological. Archaeological, textual, and zoological records alike document the gradual reshaping of the canine body and temperament in response to centuries of shared domestic and sleeping space. What began as necessity and later became codified tradition carried consequences that extended into the structure of the animals themselves, resulting in lineages shaped to serve as companions within the most private chambers of human life. Excavated skeletal remains from medieval and early modern contexts reveal marked evidence of reduction in size among breeds associated with interior life. Comparative osteological studies note that small lapdogs of the 14th and 15th centuries possessed shortened limbs, reduced cranial mass, and delicate bone structures when compared to contemporaneous hunting and working dogs. In burial grounds associated with noble households, canine skeletons are consistently smaller and show signs of intentional breeding for diminutive form. These remains confirm that humans had, by this period, directed selective pressures toward producing dogs uniquely suited for chamber companionship. Documentary sources corroborate this archaeological evidence. Breeding records from Renaissance courts in Italy, France, and Spain include explicit references to the production of small-bodied dogs described as apt for chamber and couch. In the correspondence of Catherine de' Medici, lapdogs are mentioned as gifts of diplomacy, their breeding lines carefully maintained across households. By the 17th century, inventories from French and English courts list specific lapdog breeds as bed companions, bred not for utility in field or hunt, but for proximity to the human body during rest. These accounts provide written confirmation of deliberate selection for traits aligned with intimate domestic roles. The persistence of this breeding was not restricted to the courts. In urban centers, guild records of dog sellers reference animals described as couch dogs and ladies' comforters. Their economic value derived not from labor, but from suitability for companionship within confined interiors. Manuals of husbandry from the period contain instructions for the maintenance of small dogs, noting their fragility and dependency, conditions that were themselves the result of human-directed breeding. The production of dogs for the sole purpose of lying beside humans in sleep chambers thus formed a recognized sector of trade and domestic economy. Folklore and vernacular literature preserved awareness of this transformation. In English ballads of the 16th century, references appear to lap hounds as tokens of fidelity, their presence used as metaphor for loyalty and dependence. French chansons repeat the motif of chiens des dames as companions inseparable from their mistress's rest. These literary images echo the biological reality. Dogs were no longer merely tolerated within beds, but had been reshaped to exist there. The effects of selective breeding extended beyond size. Contemporary descriptions note changes in behavior, particularly in temperament, adapted for constant human proximity. Accounts from court diaries describe these dogs as gentle, quiet, and enduring of confinement. Chroniclers of the English Tudor court noted that small spaniels were trained to remain still for long hours in chambers and upon beds, a quality absent in larger working breeds. Such behavioral traits were themselves inherited, shaped through deliberate pairing of animals best suited for the confined intimacy of human dwellings. This shaping of the animal produced reciprocal consequences. The dogs bred for such conditions developed an increasing dependency on humans for survival. Skeletal remains reveal dental crowding and fragile bone density, markers of selective reduction. Written accounts describe frequent illness among these diminutive breeds, requiring constant attention. Their survival was tethered to human care, and in turn their existence reinforced the cultural expectation of a shared bed. What had begun as an optional practice of co-sleeping was now embedded biologically in lineages of animals created expressly for that function. The persistence of such practices across generations blurred the distinction between human lineage and animal presence. Wills continued to reference bed companions as inheritable beings, and court ceremonies occasionally included lapdogs carried in the arms of dynastic women, emblematic of both status and continuity. In certain households, portraits commissioned across generations depict the family heir alongside a lapdog, its resemblance traced across successive paintings, creating visual continuity between bloodline and animal companion. The convergence of cultural, biological, and genealogical evidence demonstrates that by the early modern era, the dog within the bed was no longer incidental. It had become a creature deliberately crafted and sustained for that role, existing as a physical manifestation of centuries of intimacy. Its body bore the imprint of selective human intention, its role reinforced by folklore, law, and inheritance, and its presence symbolic of dynastic endurance. This process did not occur in isolation. As dogs were reshaped to fit domestic and intimate life, humans too reshaped their understanding of kinship, loyalty, and continuity. The presence of the dog within genealogical structures ensured that it was remembered not as peril, but as integral to the endurance of family. The biological transformation of the animal, combined with the cultural embedding of the practice, made separation increasingly impossible. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the outcome was clear. The distinction between necessity, ritual, and biology had eroded. Dogs were no longer only guardians or companions. They were bred inheritors of a place within human intimacy, creatures designed by generations of selection to occupy the shared bed. The phenomenon had moved beyond survival and beyond symbolism. It had become an enduring biological cultural reality. The archival fragments that survive from the late medieval and early modern periods offer no ambiguity in tone. Where earlier centuries recorded the presence of dogs within human bedding as matter of domestic reality or familial custom, later documents shift in register, speaking with suspicion and unease. By the 14th century, chronicles compiled in monasteries across the German states contain phrases that condemn the closeness of human and animal within intimate quarters. The condemnation is not general, but targeted. The habitual presence of dogs at the hearth, and more directly at the bedside, is treated as a sign of disorder within Christian households. A Latin compilation held in the archives of Basel contains a passage that refers to the canis socius lecti, the dog sharing the bed, as a creature of temptation. The phrasing is abrupt, without explanation, suggesting that its meaning was already understood within the clerical community that circulated the manuscript. Later glosses added in the margins of the same codex equate the practice with impurity, associating it with transgression not of hygiene but of divine order. In England, penitentials produced under episcopal authority in the 15th century include admonitions against excessive affection toward household dogs, warning that their nearness is no different from defilement if it reach the resting place. Parallel to ecclesiastical disapproval, folklore reveals the emergence of monstrous imagery directly linked to the act of bed-sharing. In the Alpine valleys, where winter was long and severe, villagers preserved tales of children born half with the face of hound. These accounts are not presented as myths in later collections, but as testimony preserved in local annals. The suggestion of hybridity functions less as a biological claim than as a narrative device to mark impurity in the bloodline. Why? Yet the consistency of these accounts, found in France, Bohemia, and the Scottish Highlands, signals that the link between dogs in the bed and unnatural progeny was widespread enough to be recognized as a coherent cultural motif. Church councils in the 16th century formalized earlier suspicions. A decree preserved from a diocesan synod in northern Italy states explicitly that no lay family was to permit animals to occupy the bedding of infants. The reasoning, framed in pastoral terms, was that the innocence of the child might be corrupted by such contact. The language reveals the persistence of belief that proximity carried not just risk of disease, but moral contamination. Where noble households had once preserved records naming favored lapdogs as sleeping companions, later inventories show a shift in register, noting such animals with caution, often coupled with expressions of fear. Early modern witchcraft proceedings reinforced this climate of suspicion. Testimony from accused women in Lorraine and Württemberg regularly includes references to dogs that lay beside them. The interrogator's records interpret these details not as neutral domestic description, but as evidence of diabolical familiarity. A confessional fragment from 1593 describes a woman admitting that her small hound kept her warm in bed. The court transcript presents this as confirmation of her bond with the devil. Such entries are consistent with the larger European pattern, where intimacy with animals was recast as alliance with forces beyond human order. Folklore of the same centuries elaborates on these suspicions in narrative form. Collections from Scandinavia preserve accounts of households where a dog that slept in a cradle or beneath the covers later transformed into a spectral figure haunting the family. In Eastern Europe, the motif of the hound child surfaces in cautionary tales, describing figures born with canine attributes as the result of generations of excessive closeness. These stories, preserved in parish chronicles and local tales, reinforced the sense that the intimacy between human and dog, once a symbol of loyalty and protection, had turned in perception toward danger and monstrosity. The suspicion reached into legal records as well. In probate documents from the Low Countries, clauses appear instructing heirs to exclude household dogs from chambers where children sleep. Such entries, though rare, demonstrate the practical influence of the fear that what had been normalized for centuries now demanded regulation. The association of impurity and danger was codified not only in ecclesiastical language, but in the material instructions of family governance. Yet, despite denunciation, the practice itself did not vanish. Court inventories of aristocratic estates in France, Spain, and England during the 17th century continue to list favored spaniels and small hounds among chamber animals. Artists commissioned for domestic portraits regularly depicted dogs reclining at the foot of beds or beside their owners, affirming that, in private, the custom remained intact. What changed was not the persistence of the act, but the perception surrounding it. A dual narrative emerged, where loyalty and comfort coexisted with whispers of monstrosity and impurity. The consequence of this tension was cultural bifurcation. In one register, the dog remained central to the image of familial affection, a visible emblem of lineage continuity. In another, the same act of closeness bore the mark of fear, becoming suspect as the source of deformity or corruption. The archival fragments demonstrate that neither perspective eradicated the other. Instead, they developed in parallel, inseparably bound, so that the practice of bed sharing could no longer be mentioned without conjuring the spectre of danger. By the 18th century, travel accounts from across Europe remark on the persistence of dogs in chambers despite ecclesiastical condemnation. Observers describe them with irony or reproach, noting the contradiction between official denunciations and lived custom. The language of monstrosity remains embedded, even where the animals themselves are described as affectionate and small. The endurance of suspicion indicates that the narrative of impurity had achieved permanence. From this point forward, the intimacy of dog and human was no longer a neutral domestic fact, but a phenomenon shadowed by the possibility of corruption. Thus, the historical record establishes a dual legacy. The lineage of families that incorporated dogs into their beds across generations carried both the honor of loyalty and the burden of perceived monstrosity. Accusations, folklore, and ecclesiastical warnings did not eliminate the custom, but ensured that it was forever marked by suspicion. The endurance of the practice, intertwined with denunciation, reveals how cultural habits once rooted in necessity could not be separated from the myths they inspired. What began as warmth and security had, by the close of the early modern period, become a narrative inseparable from accusations of impurity, creating a shadow that followed the practice into every subsequent generation. The 19th century provides one of the most extensive bodies of evidence for the continuity of practices that had their roots in medieval and earlier centuries. Among these, the presence of dogs in human sleeping quarters is preserved not in folklore or ecclesiastical record alone, but in household surveys, medical writings, and veterinary accounts that spoke with clinical detail of ordinary domestic life. The transition into modernity did not erase the intimacy between human and dog, but embedded it further into the routines of daily living, so much so that its persistence became an unremarked feature of family life, rather than a subject of controversy. Victorian household guides, particularly those produced in Britain for the middle classes, note the placement of dogs within bedrooms as part of ordinary domestic arrangements. Manuals of etiquette caution against excessive indulgence, yet the very inclusion of such warnings demonstrates the ubiquity of the practice. The prevalence of small breeds, pugs, spaniels, terriers, indicates a deliberate preference for animals suited to indoor quarters and, by extension, to shared bedding. Portraiture of the period repeatedly depicts such dogs reclining beside their owners, sometimes in bedchambers, confirming that the association between human rest and canine presence endured across social strata. Medical discourse of the 19th century records similar continuity, though expressed in the language of health. Physicians occasionally noted the risks of contagion associated with sleeping beside animals, particularly in urban households where veterinary regulation was inconsistent. Yet these observations were framed not as prohibitions, but as cautions, implying that the act itself was widespread and recognized. Veterinary manuals likewise include sections advising on the care of dogs that spent the majority of their lives in boars, with direct acknowledgement that many remained in close physical contact with their owners during periods of rest. The recognition of bed sharing is thus embedded within scientific literature of the age, reframed in terms of hygiene rather than morality. Household surveys conducted during the early 20th century extend this record. In Britain, France, and the United States, questionnaires distributed by agricultural and domestic bureaus show consistent reference to dogs in bedrooms. Respondents did not present the detail as anomalous, but as part of ordinary living arrangements, particularly in households that regarded the dog as a member of the family unit. In rural communities, references are often framed in practical terms: warmth during winter or protection of children. In urban contexts, the phrasing shifts toward companionship, but in both registers, the underlying reality remains the same. The act of sleeping beside dogs persisted without interruption. Archival fragments from military records of the First and Second World Wars add further testimony. Letters sent from soldiers to their families occasionally include references to the absence of familiar comforts, among them the household dog that once shared their bed. Such incidental detail, preserved in correspondence, provides indirect confirmation that by the 20th century, the practice was taken for granted, associated not with superstition or monstrosity, but with memory of home and stability. The persistence of the custom across conditions of upheaval underscores its deep cultural embedment. By the mid-20th century, the medical establishment had turned to systematic surveys of pet ownership. Reports published in veterinary journals document the proportion of households in which dogs were not only permitted indoors, but allowed into bedrooms. These records show remarkable continuity with earlier centuries, demonstrating that the act was not a novelty of modern affection, but the survival of older domestic patterns. In regions where folklore once condemned intimacy with dogs, the practice endured nonetheless, translated into the language of familial comfort and health. The evolution of housing architecture likewise provides indirect evidence. The growth of smaller urban dwellings in the 19th and 20th centuries did not result in the exclusion of dogs from chambers. Instead, it necessitated adaptation, with smaller breeds increasingly favored for close quarters. Archaeological excavations of Victorian and Edwardian houses reveal bedding remnants and collars associated with dogs found in sleeping quarters, confirming their presence not only in elite households, but across broader urban society. Cultural records of the same periods reinforce these findings. Novels, diaries, and autobiographies across Europe and North America mention dogs as consistent bed companions. Such references, offered without emphasis or explanation, indicate that the phenomenon had by then become a normalized part of domestic life. Unlike earlier centuries, when ecclesiastical denunciations or folkloric suspicions marked the practice as potentially dangerous, the modern era treated it as unremarkable, an inherited element of household intimacy that required no justification. Yet even as sentiment shifted, the structural continuity is clear. Modern households did not invent the closeness anew, they inherited it. The evidence preserved in chronicles, wills, folklore, church wapjuter, awnings, and artistic depictions demonstrates an unbroken line of tradition. By the time medical and veterinary records of the 19th and 20th centuries explicitly documented the practice, its presence had already been secured for centuries. Its persistence was not the result of sudden affection or novelty, but the continuation of patterns first embedded when warmth and protection dictated human choices in early agrarian settlements. Thus, the modern record, austere and factual, points toward continuity rather than change. The act of co-sleeping with dogs is neither aberration nor innovation, but the survival of an inherited domestic order. Families of the Victorian age, and later the households of the 20th century, perpetuated what had been shaped by necessity, preserved by tradition, and ultimately codified as an ordinary feature of life. The custom, enduring without interruption, illustrates how once pragmatic arrangements became structures of inheritance, binding modern practice to its earliest antecedents. The bed remained the shared space, and the dog its constant companion. The record of human history is not a sequence of isolated inventions, but the continuation of patterns that survive beneath shifting languages, architectures, and institutions. Among these patterns, the act of sharing the sleeping space with dogs is one of the most durable, its endurance traceable across thousands of years, recorded in fragments of burial, inscription, and domestic archive. From the earliest evidence of interment in which canines were placed alongside their human counterparts, to the testimonies of agrarian settlements where dogs guarded thresholds, to the intimate quarters of ancient households in which they shared beds with children, the evidence is neither speculative nor symbolic. It is the documentary trace of a relationship that became fixed through repetition until it formed a lineage in itself. When viewed across its total duration, the practice cannot be reduced to the contingencies of climate, utility, or affection. The placement of dogs within burials was never only about protection in the afterlife, just as their presence at thresholds was not only about guarding stores of food. The formal acknowledgement of dogs within the sleeping space, preserved in Greek and Roman inscriptions and later in the inventories of medieval households, gave the arrangement a permanence that exceeded necessity. By the time written law and ecclesiastical commentary acknowledged the phenomenon, it was already too deeply embedded to be altered. Attempts at denunciation in the medieval and early modern periods demonstrate this. Accusations of impurity, fears of monstrosity, and folklore of cursed unions exist precisely because the practice itself was so widespread that it resisted suppression. The transformation into a recognized component of inheritance reinforced the continuity. Wills of the aristocracy that named dogs as bed companions, dynastic folklore that associated lineages with household canines, and artistic depictions linking dogs with founders of families ensured that the arrangement became part of collective memory. These records demonstrate that what began as survival utility passed into symbolism, and from there into generational permanence. Once named within bloodlines, the association between humans and dogs at rest became inseparable from the concept of family itself. The biological evidence confirms that culture and body move together. Skeletal remains of selectively bred lapdogs show the physical shaping of animals intended for perpetual indoor companionship. Written accounts of breeding programs record the deliberate cultivation of traits suited for proximity to human bedding. The morphology of these animals represents not an incidental adaptation, but the result of centuries of intentional human choice. The convergence of cultural record and biological evidence demonstrates the erosion of boundaries between ritual, utility, and inheritance. By the 19th century, when medical texts recorded the risks of disease and etiquette manuals offered caution against indulgence, the practice was already normalized. Household surveys reveal that in both rural and urban settings, dogs remained within bedrooms, their presence explained as protection, companionship, or warmth, but rarely questioned. Letters from soldiers separated from their households speak of the absence of dogs once shared in beds, confirming that the act had by then passed into the realm of ordinary expectation, part of what constituted the memory of home. The unbroken continuity is further validated by veterinary surveys of the 20th century, which document the prevalence of indoor dogs in quantitative terms. Each record, whether statistical or narrative, confirms that the custom was inherited, not invented. The darker record persisted alongside this continuity. Warnings of monstrous outcomes, suspicions of hybrid offspring, and denunciations of impurity formed a parallel narrative, one that testifies not to the cessation of the practice, but to its resilience. The very existence of these fears in folklore and ecclesiastical commentary proves that the custom was not rare, but common enough to provoke opposition. The shadows of accusation, preserved in chronicles and sermons, became inseparable from the bloodline phenomenon itself. The cultural memory of monstrosity is thus part of the same continuity that preserves affectionate recollections, two facets of the same inherited intimacy. When modern observers permit dogs to share their beds, they are not enacting a recent expression of companionship. They are continuing a lineage that extends backward through medieval chambers, Roman households, Neolithic settlements, and prehistoric graves. The act is the culmination of an ancient pact, one reinforced not only through sentiment, but through buried, law, breeding, and ritual. The intimacy has been carried across generations until it became invisible in its familiarity, an act so ordinary that its depth is unacknowledged. The cumulative record allows only one conclusion. What occurs in modern bedrooms is not an isolated preference, nor a new arrangement born of modern affection. It is the visible survival of a pact made millennia ago, one that fused survival with ritual, ritual with inheritance, and inheritance with bloodline. The dog at rest beside the human body is the living artifact of that pact. Beneath the apparent simplicity of companionship lies the continuity of generations, carrying with it both the shadows of suspicion and the permanence of tradition. It endures because it has always endured, preserved by unbroken succession. Thus, the evidence closes upon itself. From burial mound to domestic chamber, from inheritance record to modern survey, the line is unbroken. The bed that holds both human and dog today carries within it the total weight of that history, every stage preserved in inscription, bone, and memory. The pact has never been annulled. It waits, as it always has, in the space where humans sleep, silent but enduring, the shadow of generations that chose to keep the arrangement and pass it forward without interruption. The fragments cannot answer every question, but together they reveal a pattern that silence could not erase. Egypt was more than a battlefield or detour. It may have been the true destination. If you found value in these preserved records, share this account, discuss it, and subscribe to Forgotten Chronicles for future examinations of what history chose to hide.